The Reverend Dr. Lisa Bates-Froiland grew up in Lutheran churches in small Minnesota communities of Little Falls and Wadena. Was that a preemptive cheer for Little Falls? It wasn't. All right. She attended St. Olaf College. There we go. I expected that to draw something. She graduated with a majors in speech, theater, and political science. Good preparation for being an ordained minister, right? Choosing to continue on with her education, she earned master's and doctoral degrees in speech communications from Indiana University. And then after many years of evasion, she answered a long-standing call to ordained ministry, eventually giving up her work as college professor to attend the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. In 2011, she began her first and only call at Redeemer Lutheran Church, Milwaukee, and has since then, she and that congregation have been on a remarkable journey of renewal in ways much more robust than just numerical. When Pastor Lisa came to Redeemer, I was the pastor of St. Luke Lutheran in Slinger. There already existed between Redeemer and St. Luke a historic but dormant partnership. Her arrival helped reignite that partnership, and it was a joy to work with her and to work alongside her for 6 years. Both congregations were blessed by that partnership, which continues today. In fact, there's a small stained glass window that sits in St. Luke in Slinger that was a gift from Redeemer, and part of St. Luke's recent building expansion was tithed to Redeemer. And so that partnership has been a mutual blessing for both congregations. What it really taught us was that God gives us to each other as a gift. And so on a personal note, I can share that Pastor Lisa has been a gift to me, and a gift to the faithful, both at St. Luke and Redeemer. I have no doubt that she will be a gift to us today as well, as she shares her story of renewal, and we discuss her theme of change is possible. So with that, let's welcome the Reverend Dr. Lisa Bates-Froiland.
Well, this conference has occupied a square on my October calendar for nearly all of the past 7 years, and I have come hungry and waiting to be fed with ideas and encouragement, especially early in my call. And the insights from the leaders of congregations who worship in the hundreds and even thousands have interested me greatly, but I wondered if I would also hear from a small congregation, a local congregation, a city congregation. I wondered how many people sitting near me in those early conferences were also worshiping around 40 people in a falling down building with a dearth of lay leaders. The 2016 Barna statistic is well known. The largest percentage of American churchgoers attends a congregation with less than 100 people a Sunday. Only 8% worship alongside 1,000 or more. So given those numbers, it does make sense to look at the turnarounds or the turning arounds of small congregations, those who have had a near-death experience like Redeemer, and those rare Lutheran places where people of many ages and races and walks of life worship and serve side by side together. I am really humbled to be invited to share Redeemer's story, and while it is unique in many ways, I also hope to offer you something useful for the faithful work that you are doing, wherever God has called you. So I'm going to spend most of my time telling you the story, and it's stories within story, and then I'll summarize the takeaways and point to a few potential connections at the end. There are 3 things that tie all of this together. Stewardship, that old word, which for me means doing the best you can with what you've been given. Love, perfect love that casts out fear. And how really the bread and butter pastoral acts truly make a difference. So here goes. And we could take down this slide at any time now. Thank you. I want no competition. So we talk about getting a call. Well, in the summer of 2010, I literally got a phone call cold from the Secretary of Redeemer asking would I like to supply preach twice a month while I finished seminary. I didn't know a thing about the church. I looked at the website and found 2 interesting bits. The location right next to Marquette University and as it was mentioned, my first career was as college professor, and a link to the Zeidler Center for Public Discussion, which was described as a place for people of divergent points of view to get together and discuss civilly, without an agenda of changing minds, pressing issues of the day. Intriguing. With a PhD in communication and undergraduate major in political science, this struck me as a place where I might live out my devotion to democracy and my calling as a Christian at the same time. So, okay, I'd come by and talk. They just wanted me to preach twice a month, so I thought maybe I'd meet the council president and she would check my theology and my pulse and give me the green light. Instead, I walked in and there was the entire council, and they introduced to me this 2-year strategic plan they had developed for reviving the church, and they all hugged me, and I had never met them before. Clearly, there were at least a few lay leaders who were determined to keep this congregation alive and present in its location. There were numerous red flags to notice that night, but there was a moment as well. At the end of the meeting in that dingy basement, I asked to see the sanctuary. And walking past the hallway where 5, count 'em, 5 old refrigerators were plugged in, red flag, we went upstairs and we walked in. "You've got to be kidding me," were the words that escaped my lips. I climbed up into the steps of the pulpit and I looked out. And I know you're not supposed to feel called to the stunning architecture of a worship space, but that's when something shifted in me. I felt something that I'd never felt before. You'll preach the gospel here. So what did Redeemer have going for it when I started preaching in fall 2010? Well, the third-time call pastor, Mick Roschke, was a 40-year veteran of urban ministry, and he'd been there 18 months and had already begun discipleship training and outreach to the senior low-income housing behind us. Discipleship, walking with the poor, and anti-racism were stated priorities. There was this great location, the potential of the Zeidler Center, and a spark. And though I had other options, I felt deeply called to serve there. So if you are one of those pastors that I mentioned earlier, worshiping 40 people and wondering how this is going to continue, think for a second, what does your ministry have going for it right now? I preached for the first time at Redeemer to maybe 28 people. I left out the door and I found Joe Kuykendall sitting on the steps, smoking the stub of a cigarette that had been lit a couple of times before. An elder African-American sinner saint, he'd hailed from the deep South and the mean streets of Chicago, where he'd lost a leg to a bullet inflicted as he ran from trouble. I had never had a conversation with a man like him before. And he said to me, "That gospel, you can really lay it down." That was not true that day, I know it. But he gave me what I needed to aspire to in my preaching. I would really need to lay it down once I got a sense of what that meant. Grit and grace in plain, honest words. Grit and grace to have even a chance at meeting the wide variety of people gathered there. As for Joe, in the next 3 years, on Maundy Thursday, I would wash his one foot, anoint his head with oil before he started chemo, and officiate his funeral. By that time, I knew him pretty well. For all of the creative and the bold and the innovative moves that we've made at Redeemer, truly, the beating heart of the Renewal, from the vantage point of leader, is the oldest fashioned, most central and basic of the pastoral arts. Home and hospital visitation, personal prayer, Bible study, handwritten notes, funerals. And asking this question that I've stolen from my Presbyterian colleague up the street: how is it with your soul? I finished the MDiv in December, and talk of calling me to Redeemer surfaced. They didn't have the money for it. The 3 income stream for Redeemer at that time were congregational giving, very meager rent from a couple of building users, those were the people with the 5 refrigerators, and an endowment account that was rapidly bleeding out. They were desperate and willing to cut corners and personally push the synod into authorizing the call. The synod staff person spoke out loud what I found out later was the conventional wisdom about Redeemer at Wisconsin Avenue. It should close. A most unusual 2-year term call for me began on March 1, 2011. It would be a 3/4 time call split in half between Word and Sacrament Ministry for Redeemer and serving as the first executive director of the Zeidler Center for Public Discussion, because there was some money there from a bequest, $73,000 to see what could happen. The first council meetings that I attended included open talk of closing and no laughter. That's another red flag. The council president kicked off meetings by asking each person to share, what do we celebrate at Redeemer? And people would actually answer, nothing. Financial reports were indecipherable. Why was there still a funded budget line for choir robe maintenance when I had never seen a choir robe? The church secretary was doing nearly everything related to the finances. Red flag the size of a football field. And she would type out a paragraph for the treasurer, who is not a treasurer, to read aloud. Get the money straight, or it won't matter how well you lay down the gospel. During those meetings, my ears went red, my stomach tightened. Redeemer folks were warm and wonderful on Sunday morning at the sharing of the peace, but there was serious distress and unspoken conflict in the leadership. Thank God for crises. Thank God for crises. Terrifying, purifying, edifying, and inspiring. The first of 3 key crises showed itself 3 months in. A developer came forward with an offer to purchase all or some of Redeemer. We could be part of a whole block solution that would involve retail and Marquette and student housing and us somehow if we wanted it. Nearly $2 million was on the table. Seemed like our ticket to a new day. But Redeemer had rebuffed offers like this before. Pastor Mick and I hashed out possibilities. We knew we couldn't sit on something like this for long. We talked to the president ahead of time. She was cold to the idea. The next meeting of the full council would be during our field trip to ELCA headquarters, and I know I'm not supposed to call it that, church-wide in Chicago. We would have to share it there at the end of the tour and several hours of meetings with church-wide staff. So it was 5:30 p.m. when it was finally time for council. We had been sitting in the same room, kind of like you all, nearly all day. We were hungry. I was really hungry, and that is never good. I was scared. We prayed together, and then I shared the offer, the LOI. And the room quickly divided between out of the question and, wait a minute, maybe God is telling us something here. I suggested we take 3 weeks for individual prayer on this, keeping it to ourselves as an intentional time of discernment. Pray and listen. And in 3 weeks, we would share what had happened. I knew we needed better conditions for the next conversation. Mick and I made lasagnas, and his was much better than mine. I hired a pianist. After we ate, we went up to the sanctuary. I had found 10 of our nicest chairs and positioned them in an oval at the front. I lit a 3-wicked candle and put it in the middle. We used communication agreements from the Zeidler Center's method. A question would be asked, there would be silence, the first person would speak uninterrupted for up to 2 minutes, and another silence. The pianist offered ambient music and time for us to calm ourselves between each question. In the silence before the first speaker, and I knew who it was going to be and that he was a known naysayer, I had the strong impression of feeling the words, "Prepare to be amazed." Sure enough, he said his prayers led him to believe we should go forward, figuring out just what this opportunity could be. A buttload of ponderous meetings followed, and we were able to receive the pro bono services of a real estate attorney named Jen Manna. Years later, she joined the church. I officiated her marriage to Dan and later baptized baby Xavier. With God's mercy and grace, the following May, a congregational vote accepting an offer to sell the western half of the building and land passed, with just one no. Now, the offer fell apart on the developer's end, but we'd exacted, I think, a great victory, a healthy detachment from the building, a spiritual freedom. We could be the Redeemer congregation somewhere else if that call came and God showed us that's what we were to do. We began kicking off council meetings with the question, what's our plan B? Meaning, if we're not here in the building as it is now, what form could our ministry take? In the middle of that year of the land sale proposal, on a cold March day, I took a break to walk around the building and I looked out the window of the large auditorium on the upper level. I saw students along the sidewalk about 75 yards from Redeemer handing out sandwiches and soup to people who came up and chatted and moved along. Oh Lord, I realized reluctantly, we are the church. They need to be inside here, in this huge heated building. So I invited the students and their campus ministry advisor to meet with our council. Redeemer Council has always been good at recognizing what is consistent with our mission. Noon Run at Redeemer began the next fall. With gratitude to Siebert Lutheran Foundation, we now employ a cook who prepares hot, nutritious meals, and the serving is carried out by a sweet mashup of Marquette students, partner congregations, local businesses, roving mission groups, and people from the neighborhood. One of my mentors told me early on, figure out what you have of value and give it away for free. And that's the gospel, isn't it? God had something of great value, salvation through the love of his Son, Jesus Christ, and he gave it to us for free. And we had A, that message, B, space, and C, we were able to find free food. We went out to meet our neighbors in biblical fashion, 2 by 2, walking and talking, listening and taking notes. We called it neighborhood mapping. The 68 blocks, somebody else decided it should be 68 blocks, 68 blocks around us are a mix of businesses and social services, academic buildings, apartment buildings, a couple of houses. We spoke to whoever we encountered and entered every open door. And it wasn't about, I'm Pastor Lisa from Redeemer Lutheran on 19th and Wisconsin Avenue. We worship at 10 a.m. Why don't you check us out? The question instead was, what do you think would make this neighborhood an even better place to live and work? Miraculously, the relationships and partnerships and familiarity that came from that simple process have enriched us and made us recognizable again in the neighborhood. After we did the whole 68 blocks, which took 2 summers, we went back to places of particular interest. One summer, we went to each of the bars in the 68 block region. We figured they might need a little Jesus and we might need a little beer. My 2-year term call was set to expire in March 2013. Pastor Mick had chosen to retire. It was abundantly clear that staffing had to change. I told only the president, vice president, and an endowment representative that I would not continue beyond the 2 years with the current staff in place. Redeemer couldn't afford the positions as they were configured and realistically move forward in mission. Because a church's mission is never the employment of any one individual, no matter who they are or what their circumstances. It was a painful and imperfect process, but in January 2013, we terminated the positions of music director and secretary. The eventual announcement met with a mixed reaction, to put it mildly, and several people left the congregation. I asked a handful of people to help clean out and reorganize the main office with me. For 5 days, 9 to 5, 8 people worked their hearts out. The neglect that we found made me want to cry. We found numerous IRS mailings that had never been opened, for instance. Yet the dedication of the people around me assured me of the Spirit's presence. We went without a secretary until August of that year. That's 8 months. Dividing the duties, we muddled through. The new position would be communications specialist, and in fashioning that position, we course-corrected the designation of financial responsibilities as well. A congregational vote to extend my call indefinitely was scheduled for 4 weeks from those dismissals, as was my point and intention. As I found out later, after the vote, 2 gentlemen from the Milwaukee Rescue Mission who had joined the congregation earlier steeled their courage and spoke out on my behalf. Despite all that we'd been through, the vote was a unanimous yes. We changed worship. The worshiping community was diverse, and worship, which is the work of the people to praise and glorify God, needed to reflect the souls of those present. Can you imagine belonging to a church where you never, ever sang your favorite song? We extended the gritty grace of my preaching into the liturgy and the song selection. Accessible, variable, soulful, with attention to tone and mood. The current director of music, Meredith Sipes-Sumner, and I plan seasonally and weekly. That woman preaches when she sings. I was a teenage organist. I like to say that as if I was kind of like a vampire or something. I was a teenage organist. And the hymns are like a spiritual language system for me. I'm glad that we collaborate so well. It took time and trial and error to get there. We find that the Sunday morning experience is crucial, and that's a carefully chosen word since it must point people to the cross again and again. And not everybody reads music. Not everybody reads at Redeemer. So there must be good chunks of every service that each person can participate in fully, can bring their whole self to. When it comes to worship at Redeemer, I always say nobody is happy all the time, but everybody is happy some of the time. People began inviting their family, coworkers, and friends to worship. Every time we took in new members, I would ask how they came to Redeemer for the first time. In a small church, it's nearly always by personal invitation, and it usually takes at least 3 no's before you get to a yes. Only recently have we had visitors come because of our reputation or if somebody recommended us. I can tell that we've evolved from the visitor comments that I hear. In the beginning, it was, ooh, the incredible architecture. Then it became, nice sermon, Pastor. And now it is, what a wonderful community you have here. By early 2014, the council had mostly new leaders who had joined the church in the last 5 years. It was time to blow up the ridiculous budget template and make it understandable and transparent. So one Saturday, the council plus endowment board got together, and I proposed a kind of jubilee. The financial accounting was so mucked up, it was beyond repair. We had to start with our real balances in our real bank accounts and construct what I called a missional budget. We started with this basic question: what is this church for? And then what do we need to do in order to accomplish that? That meeting probably lasted 4 hours, and we didn't finish in one sitting. We had 14 very dedicated people willing to hash it out. Crisis number 2 arrived in October 2014 in the form of a dead boiler. I thought we were done for sure. I really did. I saw the amount in our bank accounts and the endowment all together, and it would not pay for a replacement boiler. In prayer and conversation, we felt the prodding of the Spirit to at least give it a good try. The first $5 donation came from a guest at that noon run meal. The council and the endowment board met, huddled in quilts, literally. In prayer, we reflected on who was colder than we were during that meeting, and we determined that our efforts to raise money for a new boiler for ourselves had to be paired with a drive for hats and gloves and mittens and scarves and blankets for our friends without homes. My atheist Aunt Cheryl sent over hand-knit hats from Minnesota. It was a friend on Facebook who suggested GoFundMe, which was still kind of new in 2014, and I had never heard about. We tried to make our GoFundMe campaign inspiring and entertaining rather than pathetic and groveling. The dollars trickled in slowly and steadily. Soon it got too cold to be in the building. One member offered to pay for hot air to be pumped in to keep the pipes from freezing. I called up John Maher of Brett Funeral Home next door, whom I met while neighborhood mapping. I asked if we could worship at the funeral home while the boiler was out. He said yes without hesitation, and don't you dare try to pay for it. He wheeled over a special cart to pick up the hymnals and then wheeled them back to his place. That Saturday night, I have pictures of it. It was awesome. I have pictures. That Saturday night, special cart. That Saturday night, as I wrote my sermon, a Journal Sentinel reporter who had seen the GoFundMe campaign wrote an article and posted it about our plight. The local TV stations read it before I was even awake the next morning, and they met me on the doorstep of the funeral home. So I did 3 TV interviews before our little worship service. The choir sang, "Humble thyself in the name of the Lord," that morning. And when the story aired that noon, a woman who was recovering from shoulder replacement surgery happened to be watching. She called to her daughter, "Bring me my checkbook." She wrote a check for $30,000 that fulfilled the goal of the campaign. But here's the deal. When I spoke to her on the phone, a familiar lesson repeated itself. The traditional core of being church matters. The basics, the feeling of belonging. As a little girl, this woman recalled being chosen to read the story of Jesus' birth on Christmas Eve at Redeemer. At Redeemer, she was baptized and confirmed. It still meant something to her all those decades later. The experience of the boiler crisis had a lot to do with the resurgence of Redeemer. We had shared a communal experience of God's saving grace, and we received a clear message to keep serving the neighborhood. I learned that Redeemer folks had more money to give than I knew before. Having endured the purchase offer, welcoming hungry and homeless 6 days a week to be among us, and the new boiler, we were still standing. The people trusted me as their leader, and I didn't and I don't take that lightly. We still worried about money all the time, though we'd added income streams by that point of grants, better renters, partner congregations, and a few individual donors from outside the congregation. Christmas Eve 2015, and I was excited to baptize a little girl named, and I kid you not, Miracle. But just as the service began, a man I'd never seen entered the sanctuary, vocalizing and moving erratically, dramatically and repeatedly flicking his lighter. The men nearby looked around nervously. My husband went into the narthex to call the police. As I began the service, he and I were competing for the room. I used an old teacher trick, and I stood right next to him as I spoke the opening liturgy. When I had to leave that space, I tossed a look over to Meredith, and she knew exactly what to do. She sat right next to the man, calmly, wordlessly breathing in and out. Soon the man was sound asleep. He slept peacefully through the sermon and Miracle's baptism. And then when it was time for the Lord's Prayer, where it is our custom to all hold hands in one big circle, Miracle's big sister, age 6, also decked out entirely in white for the evening, came running up the aisle to place her hand on the sleeping man's shoulder. Her name is Joy. Perfect love casts out fear. Facing fear and finding grace became another way we understood our ministry at Redeemer. A great woman of faith named Marcia taught me so much about that. She invited me very intimately into the last months of her journey with lung cancer, and she held nothing back. We talked openly about her funeral, how she wanted the whole service to proclaim very boldly her faith in Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, as her strength and purpose for the entirety of her life and death. In the last months of her life, she had unfinished business she wanted to work on. She had never fully forgiven the young men who murdered her grandfather, and she had never played Scrabble. So I brought out a Scrabble board and Joyce, the woman who danced with Marcia in the kitchen to Motown that first summer of Noon Run where we were on our own serving that meal, and Marcia wasn't quite so sick. White and black, these two moving and shaking and laughing as they served. And then months later, the Scrabble game. It was painful to watch. Joyce had never played Scrabble either, and she did not mind cheating. She was grateful to see her friend for the last time. And when the end neared, Marcia called me out to meet with her whole family to go over the funeral one last time. Marcia at this point was skeletal, her hair fried strands about her scalp, her voice raspy. Husband Chuck had appeared to me only as a man of few words up to that point, but that afternoon he spoke up with his suggestion for the service. And in the most romantic display of married love that I have ever witnessed, he read aloud Proverbs 31 to honor his dying beloved. A capable wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. When Marcia died in the beautiful hospice center where she had once volunteered, I offered to stay until John Maher could come for her. His schedule was awkward, so it ended up being 3 hours. I prayed and sat and started scribbling the sermon for the next day. It was holy time. When I preached her funeral, Sam Friedman, religion writer for the New York Times, was there. His stepdaughter was married to Marcia's son. He'd met me at their wedding a year earlier. So when people ask me, how did you end up featured in the New York Times? The answer is, really and honestly, because of old-fashioned pastoring making a connection and an impression. Well, now you haven't heard about a crisis for a few minutes, so here comes crisis number 3, the pipes. Turns out that our stronger new boiler found all kinds of weaknesses and leaks in the pipes, and I had made the mistake of not asking for enough money in the initial campaign. Hadn't padded it. The first estimate for repairs was north of $25,000, which felt impossible after raising $78,000 the year before. I could not summon up the song and dance again. Furthermore, I didn't want Redeemer to veer from one crisis to the next, constantly begging for money in order to survive. It was time to grow to a degree of self-sufficiency. We instituted the Building Repair and Restoration Fund, BRR, BRR, get it? We had an anniversary coming up in February of 2017. Got to use those anniversaries for missional good. So we set the goal of a balance of $100,000 the day we celebrated 100 years of worship in our sanctuary. Now, when surprises happened, we could handle them without panicking. We could get after deferred maintenance, projects that weren't emergencies, small beautification efforts. It felt good to have significant money in the bank at last. Now we weren't the one catastrophe away from death. One day, a woman who was new to the church and to Christianity came up to me and said, "Pastor, I've got a question. What's this narthex? What the heck is a narthex?" And I explained what it was, and she goes, "There's so much that I don't know." It goes back to what the person was saying earlier about explanation. And so she and I brainstormed together, and she's now the council president, a way of teaching the faith and Lutheranism in tiny little pieces on Sunday morning, because we knew we weren't going to get people to come out on an evening. So within worship itself, we would take 15 minutes, and I would either do a little lecture or a video. Sometimes we did game shows to be able to educate on the basics. It was really kind of a confirmation curriculum, right smack dab in the middle of worship, and everybody was doing it at the same time, no matter how old they were. We celebrated because St. Matthew's in Wauwatosa loaned us some confirmation robes, and we put people in it, whether they were 17 or 78 years old, with a red carnation, and we all had confirmation together that May, and we learned a lot along the way. We've said yes to a lot of things along the way, including 3 beehives that are now up on our rooftop as our way of acknowledging our call to care for creation, but also as a way to be able to illustrate a metaphor of discipleship, that we are sent out into the world to pollinate the world with God's love, to bring back nourishment then for the hive, and then to go out again. Those 3 beehives have allowed a lot of people who are even more scared of church than of bees to come and meet us together. Whenever possible, so we said yes to a lot of things, including bees, and no to many more. And we've also said this isn't working out any longer several times. Whenever possible, when you need to say to a ministry or someone else who's sharing your space, this isn't working out any longer, we learned a way of parting on good terms. Milwaukee is a small town, and it's a small, small Lutheran world after all. Peace and goodwill must reign. So Redeemer is constantly reinventing itself. I think some people call that an agile church. We've detached from an idol of permanence. And although a few lay leaders read a lot of books on church renewal before I arrived, my work has involved just 2 texts, the Bible and the lives of the people at and around Redeemer. And as I often say, there are no dull people at Redeemer, not one. Sometimes it would be nice if there were one dull person at Redeemer. So my whole system of keeping track of time, there it is. Not much time. I wanted to give you a little walking tour of Redeemer Church. Let's see how far we can get in just a few minutes. Let's have brunch together down at Miss Katie's first. It's down on the corner. Donald Trump has eaten there, as well as Michelle Obama and others. We'll finish up our meal, and then we'll get out and we'll walk up the hill, walking past Grand Haven, the HUD housing, where the seniors that are sitting outside will remark on how big Titus the church dog is getting. We have a church dog in our ministry now. We walk past picnic tables where Noon Run used to be, and we look up and we see a mural painted on the wall. I'll show it to you in a minute. Public art is something I think everyone should have access to, no matter what neighborhood they're in. And so last summer, we installed the Bee mural. Let's go inside. My office is on the right, and in those chairs have sat people who are jittery with their addiction, hopeful engaged couples, questioning young adults, and one fine morning, Marquette President Mike Lovell. We cruise through the main office, meeting communications specialist Eris Townsend, and we enter the fireside lounge, optimistically named, since there is a fireplace, but there has not been a fire in it for a good 15 years, maybe someday. Now this room is not for sitting beside a fire, but sitting beside each other, for things like a Bible study on Job, where not one, but 2 women at the table are in journeys with breast cancer. Last week, one of them, wearing a wig for the first time out in public, felt vulnerable and brave enough to share a story that she'd kept to herself for 35 years. In the worst days of an abusive marriage, she gazed into a campfire and strongly perceived a diabolical message. Things would all work out for you if you just gave up your attachment to Jesus. There was a pause, and then her witness. But I couldn't do that. And there were even worse days to come. But Jesus delivered me from that, and I have experienced happiness and love that I couldn't have imagined. that night by the campfire. Redeemer folks are truthful about lives, our lives, and God's presence in them. They are fluent in their faith, and I didn't train them to do that. This has been new to me. We've been led into this kind of communication by people who were not raised Lutheran in the Midwest, if I can be honest with you. And they're usually not white, if I can be even more honest with you. The struggle, the pain, and the celebration are all understood and talked about as a long walk with Jesus. Into the dining hall where noon run happens, like a second congregation that I serve as chaplain. There's an accompaniment model here where we are alongside. I engage in friendly chatter. I'm doing spiritual checkups that I hope they don't know. I ask about their health, their housing, their relationships. They're the ones that bring up religion to me. And I've learned how to break up the occasional fight. The kitchen looks pretty darn nasty. But who has volunteered there over the years? A Jesuit priest, an alderman, fancy pants lawyers, kids, partner churches. Let's leave the dining hall, and before we go up the stairs, there's Charlie Keenan's office, a resident beekeeper. Shouldn't every church have a resident beekeeper? Through training noon run guests in beekeeping, he learned that Quentin was quite an artist. Working long hours with Quentin, he helped him secure an art show in a Wauwatosa gallery last fall. Let's go upstairs. There's the library at the end of the hall where recovery groups meet, and on Sundays it's the nursery. Because in a city church, every room has to be multi-use. You do the best you can with what you have. Up to the rooftop to observe 3 active beehives, a vertical garden, and a view of Wisconsin Avenue. Down to the auditorium where we spin honey side by side and dip beeswax candles together. We go through the spaceship lounge where a new mural is taking place, one that will picture the portals to the heaven. At the end of the hall, what used to be used 2 hours a week as the choir room is now the bustling Zeidler Center office. When I started, we had 6 trained facilitators. Now there's more than 400 at work in the city, doing things like community and police dialogues. And I'm not responsible for that. The only good thing I did was to pass that role over to Dr. Catherine Wilson. She's been responsible for the growth. There is one room left, the sanctuary. And of course, every sanctuary holds 1,000 stories at least. And I could write a book on just what I've heard and seen there, and I've told you a couple already. But there's just one thing. There's a crack in the terrazzo floor, right in the middle of the place. There's a crack there that is undeniably present. For us, it has become another text of our life together and our life with Jesus. It's the brokenness of the world, or us, which has been filled in and made whole by the grace of God. So how did Redeemer go from being the church everyone thought would close to what it is today? I think by being Lutheran, really Lutheran, and being open, and knowing that it's all about the work of the Holy Spirit. There's a ton of stuff that I could have told you had happened that we had no responsibility or hand in at all. It was only the working of the Holy Spirit and us willing enough to stay out of the way. I want to share just a couple of slides. I hope they're ready. This is for the note takers in the crowd. So the idea here is I'm just going to list off and name some of the processes that I mentioned in the story. And if you want to reach out to me, I probably have PowerPoints on each one of these. So the Zeidler style dialogue that we used during that first critical meeting, neighborhood mapping, got a lot of material on that. The idea of a missional budget, I have that as well. And then the faith foundations at Redeemer, that was that kind of confirmation for all program. What we've learned together so far, that desperation and crisis are actually gifts, that we face our fears and we find grace. Our church vitality comes from reinventing constantly. We'll never be done. We'll never, ever be done. And that the communication climate matters so much and has to be attended to carefully. When somebody says something brusque, it needs to be addressed right away. Lessons for the leader: watch and listen carefully to God at work. Steward the stories of the community. That's what I just demonstrated to you. If I can tell you the stories of the community, I can tell you God at work. People usually want to help, but they don't know how. That comment about ambiguity really rested with me. And unfortunately, especially when you're small, the pastor's spirit and energy sets the tone. And that goes right into a plea for self-care. Pace yourself, be healthy, so that you can bring that energy and spirit to match what's going on. I think I made this clear. We are a multiracial church united in Christ, and that's a little bit unique for Lutherans, especially ELCA Lutherans. So listen more than you speak and be yourself. You may wonder, is that for the white people or the black people or the brown people? The answer is yes. If we tell everybody to listen more than they could speak, I think it would be pretty interesting. Apologize and extend forgiveness and receive forgiveness. We don't do racism training. We just live together, walking together. And so, of course, we sometimes bump up against each other and we say things that are butt-headed. And if we have an open enough climate to handle it on the spot, then we can move forward because we got bigger fish to fry. Intentional representation. If your congregation is half black and half white, your council's got to be half black and half white. It's just that simple. Change worship to reflect the people who are there. That's against the notion of, once we get them in the door, we'll assimilate them, and then we'll all be singing Beautiful Savior in harmony. Extended sharing of the peace. This is not everybody's jam, and I know that. But at Redeemer, it's what we do. And it's really, really important that we embrace one another no matter what's going on. We do make sure that we say, if you don't want to participate, that's absolutely fine. Stay in your seat. We'll wave to you. We'll give this gesture. We give lots of options. But the sharing of the peace goes on so long, I now have a gong that I ring 3 times, like, sit down. But it's been really critical. Sometimes I call that the second sermon. This is Titus the church dog. You just had to see him. He's 1 year old. This is Charlie. So these are resources if you want to reach out and connect. Charlie Keenan, the Bee Evangelist, he's willing to set up an urban bee ministry at any of your congregations, suburban too. We've found it's a great way to be able to be shoulder to shoulder working on something where nobody's the expert. Very multi-age as well. Here's the Zeidler Center communication, zeidlercenter.org. There's the bee mural. And even more important, here's what it looked like before. So this is the way it started, and that's kind of a metaphor for what it felt like overall at Redeemer, that we started with a lot of hurdles, and somehow we were able to find grace. I just got to, forgive me, I'll give you your time back one way or another. I got to tell you the flower story. This is Redeemer's favorite story. So as I said, we are a block away from the largest homeless shelter, the Mission. Also nearby is WISN, the TV station, and that's in between the walk to Redeemer. So the first summer when we were doing Noon Run, we did it outside. I don't know why, it was so much work. But we met a guy named Tony, and he would be the first one there, and he would set out the chairs, and he was always coming up and saying, Pastor Lisa, this is just not right about the look of the church. I said, I know, we don't have any money to fix anything up around here. And he would try to find tools and do things, but I appreciated him and appreciated effort. I found out he used to be a caretaker for a church before he had a clonk on the head and things went south for him. Anyway, one day I was leaving church after Noon Run. It was about 3:30, and I looked up and I saw somebody had planted flowers in front of the sign. And I thought it was somebody from the congregation. I thought, that is so nice, a sign of hope. These flowers are here. I'm so delighted. And so I went back, and the next day at Noon Run, I sat at the table with a couple of guys, and I said, man, I noticed these flowers out here. Really looks nice. And the guy looked at me and smiled, and he said, yeah, I don't think WISN is going to miss those flowers at all. So maybe it was Tony who was able to pilfer these flowers in the light of day, because they have to be in before sundown, and he transplanted them there. So Tony later got a job in another Lutheran church. We were able to help him find employment in another Lutheran church that had a home next to it. So he was out of homelessness, back taking care of a church for quite a while, but he didn't fully say goodbye to us, and he still comes by and he waxes the floors in the dining hall 3 times a year. Yeah. So again, I guess to finish this all up, besides the laughing about the stolen flowers, is just to be encouraged that it's not up to us. It's not up to our wizardry or boldness or creativity. It is somewhat up to our love and up to our willingness to listen hard for where the Holy Spirit is leading. Amen.